Most of you know that a team from our church went to Haiti not long ago, and I was one of the 15 people that was privileged to go. And I don't want to share all of my stories at once, but I do want you to have an idea of what a wonderful experience that was, and literally what kind of life-changing ministry took place there. There are, in fact, countless stories that I could tell. Words are really inadequate to describe just the place of Haiti itself. While in so many ways, Haiti's a beautiful place. I mean, the scenery, the geography, the mountains, it is absolutely beautiful. And while it is beautiful in so many ways, it's also a very sad place. There's trash all over the ground. There's water that runs beside the makeshift trail, and that water that runs by that trail is used for washing, it's used for bathing, and it's used for carrying away human waste. There are no amenities like we have here in the States. You get the picture. At some level, with those who are needy, I'm generally a compassionate person. And so I thought that while we were there that we would be exercising compassion on the people, and we did, but in fact it was so much more than that. So let me explain. We were playing with the kids in front of the house where we stayed, and the house is right by the church, and I had gotten down on my knees with several of the kids and we were playing, and when it came time to stop playing and I stood up, a little boy quickly moved over and began to pat my pant legs from the knees down, making sure that all of the dust was being removed from my pant legs. And I looked at him and kind of motioned like, stop, don't do that, but he didn't stop. I'm a preacher after all, so I'm seldom at a loss for words. So I stood there, a man of great privilege by comparison to this precious little boy. I have a nice home. I have 2 cars, we have health insurance, I have a good income, even have a plan for retirement someday. And this little boy who had no privilege, who lived in a small concrete block structure, no cars, no health insurance, no prospect for any kind of income, likely ever, and no thought of the retirement concept at all, not even enough food to eat every single day, that little boy was exercising compassion on me. That was the first of many times that I had to turn my head away just to keep from being seen as tears rolled down my cheeks. Compassion is the subject for today as we continue through the gospel according to Matthew. What compassion does is the title of the message. What compassion does, from Matthew chapter 14. And we'll begin reading with verse 13, and I will invite you to stand, please, as we show respect to the Lord for His Word. Matthew 14, verse 13. Now, when Jesus heard this, and He's just heard about the death of John the Baptist, when Jesus heard this, He withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by Himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed Him on foot from the towns. When He went ashore, He saw a great crowd, and He had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to Him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They said to Him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish." And He said, "Bring them here to me." Then He ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, He looked up to heaven and said a blessing. And then He broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Thank you so much. You may be seated. There are all kinds of lessons to learn from this text. And in fact, since this is one of those quintessential New Testament texts, I sort of come to it with fear and trembling, because those of you that have walked with Christ any length of time or certainly been involved in the life of a church, I'm sure that you've heard tremendous sermons preached on this particular text. There are a lot of lessons to be learned, but I also have tied together these 2 biblical texts, Matthew 14, 13 through 21, as well as Matthew 15, 32 through 39, because the principles that we glean from chapter 14 are in fact many of the same principles that we would be gleaning from chapter 15. So when we get to chapter 15 in a few weeks, you'll understand why we move past verses 32 through 39. Now, some people have tried to say, like they have with various accounts of Jesus cleansing the temple, some have said these two accounts are really two accounts, but literally of the same thing, but just some variations on the details. Well, I don't believe that. In fact, I believe these were two separate situations that occurred, just like I believe that Jesus cleansed the temple more than one time. I think he fed the multitudes miraculously this way more than once. So we're going to talk about what compassion does. But before we get to that point, we need to take just a brief detour to sort of lay the foundation and set the stage for what we're to learn this morning. So here's the detour. Compassion doesn't free one from the heartaches of life. Perhaps I should say exercising compassion does not free one from the heartaches of life. Look with me again at verse 13 in our text. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. What had Jesus heard? Do you remember what we learned from last week, what we found out about? And Jesus hears this. He had just heard that John the Baptizer had been killed. And he wasn't killed in a freak accident, not that that would make his grief any less acute. But as Jesus gets this news, he knows that it is senseless and it is very selfish and it never should have happened this way from at least the human perspective. And John was killed on purpose. He was killed, you'll recall, because a young female who danced in a sexually provocative way got her way with the old perverted king, now her stepfather, who was having less than wholesome thoughts about her and had John's head cut off and brought in on a platter. That's what Jesus hears. He knows now how John has died. John was his friend. John was his co-worker in ministry. John was his cousin. Now remember, Jesus was a man, and the truth is we too easily forget that reality. He was fully God, yes, but he was also fully man. His mother carried him for 9 months. He came out and cried like a baby. Why? Because he was a baby. He played whatever games little Jewish boys played in that time. We know some things about the humanity of Jesus. We know that he sat. We know that he stood. We know that he talked. We know that he walked. He sailed. He sang and he prayed. And no doubt, if he was like most people would have been, like you and I would be, he had memories of going to his cousin's house, hanging out, and now John is dead. Now, we know it's hard to imagine Jesus as fully human. And in our text, we see his supernatural power at work as he feeds some 5,000 plus people. We see the supernatural at work in this text, but the text begins with not the supernatural Jesus, but rather a very, very human Jesus. He's facing loss, death. In this section of the Scripture, there is what theologians and grammarians refer to as an inclusio. There will be a test, so write this down. The inclusio occurs in verses 13 and 14, and also will occur in verses 22 and 23, which we'll deal with later. Suffice it to say, it is literally like a bracketed portion within the larger text. It's an aside, a kind of set to the side, let's just put this over here for a moment kind of issue. So Jesus hears what has happened to John, and he's moved with sorrow. He withdraws in a boat to a desolate place all alone. And Jesus, please don't miss this, Jesus, just like you and me, wants a little time to get his mind around the loss that has just occurred. He needs some time to grieve, but it's not to be. As soon as he gets there, people are waiting. It reminds me, and this is a maybe a bad analogy, but reminds me of Ronald McDonald. I remember working at McDonald's in high school and into college, and if Ronald McDonald would show up and he was ever around, he had lollipops on a belt and he carried them, and every kid in the place would run up and try to get a lollipop from the belt of Ronald McDonald. Nobody would leave him alone. That's kind of a picture of what Jesus is dealing with here. Even in his grief, even in his sorrow, even though he's trying to go off to a desolate place, he cannot be by himself. People are waiting, so his contemplation is now paused as he begins to deal with the crowd. There's no doubt Jesus was focused on John's death, but I have a hunch, can't prove it, but I have a hunch it was a whole lot more. I think not only did he grieve over John, just as he did when Lazarus had died, but I also think that Jesus was thinking about his own death. I think that while Jesus was here on this hill far away, he was thinking of another hill that would soon be not so far away. I think he was thinking about Calvary, and it was all in those moments beginning to close in on him. We know that John's death foreshadows the death of Jesus. And as we think about Jesus, we know that no one has ever been more loving, no one has ever been more forgiving, no one has ever been more embracing, nobody has ever been more compassionate than Jesus. And look at what happened to him. So, exercising compassion doesn't free one from the heartaches of life. So let's dig in. What does compassion do? First of all, compassion sees. Look with me at verse 14. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Compassion sees. Jesus saw the great crowd. He sees, he notices, he doesn't look over the crowd, he doesn't look past the crowd, he doesn't look around the crowd, he doesn't look through the crowd. In other words, if Jesus had been stopped at 152 in Liberty and encountered a man holding a sign that said, "We'll work for food," Jesus would not have put on his sunglasses. He would not have fidgeted with his phone. Jesus would not have looked away or mumbled something under his breath about, "I wonder what he did to get in that position." He would have looked right at the man and taken in every single thing about him in order to fully comprehend and understand his pain, his hurt, his motives, and how the man felt. He would have noticed. For many of us, when our thoughts are interrupted, or our schedules are interrupted, or our plans are interrupted, we have a bit of a negative reaction, don't we? Here, Jesus has just lost someone very dear to him, and he's trying to clear his head. He's contemplating his friend's death, and I think he's probably contemplating his own death, and he can't get away from the people. But rather than exhibit anger, he demonstrates compassion. So first of all, compassion sees. Secondly, this morning I want you to note not only compassion sees, but compassion cares. Verse 14 again, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Jesus, more than anybody else, demonstrated care perfectly. What he saw in terms of people and what they were dealing with, it did something to him, and he cared. He couldn't turn away, but rather than turning away, or rather than thinking in terms of other so-called important things that he had to do, he was God after all, right? But what does he do? He jumps in and begins helping. I want you to notice something here. I want you to notice something important here. Jesus did not ask, and I think, by the way, it would be in the text if it had played out this way, although I can't prove that. But Jesus not only jumps in to help, but I want you to notice what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't here ask about all their circumstances. It's not recorded anyway. He didn't have to find out how they lost their job. He didn't have to find out all of the other hoops that they would have to jump through in order to get some help prior to his coming on the scene. He didn't have to find out about who else had been talking to them. He didn't have to find out what other agencies they had gone to or who they might have talked to about getting help. What does he do? He just helps them. And here's one we need to consider too. We don't know exactly where these people came from originally. Stay with me. We don't know. We know where they are now, but we don't know where they came from in the original sense, right? So we need to exercise, and I want to say this to us across the board as believers, we need to exercise some caution in our responses to public discourse these days. There needs to be some balance in the conversation these days, and frankly, what I'm about to say probably won't sit well with anybody. So that means it's probably a good thing to say. Hear me very clearly, lest I be misunderstood, and please don't anybody nuance or massage what I'm about to say. If you quote me verbatim. I completely agree, as we should, as good citizens, that we should do what we can to keep our country safe. Totally fine with that. But listen carefully. If we're not concerned for or grieving over people in other nations who aren't safe, or people in other nations who would do anything to get their families to the safety of a place like America because they, just like we, don't want to have to worry about being beaten or robbed or raped or tortured or having enough food, if we don't feel something for them, politics aside, I'm telling you, something is desperately wrong. If we lack compassion for people strictly because they weren't given the benefit of being born in America, something is wrong. Not with them, but with us. Why are we so fortunate? Is it because we're that much better than the rest of the world? I mean, after all, America, we're a great, shining, moral example to the rest of the world these days, right? I mean, God has to bless America, right? We say the Pledge of Allegiance. Sometimes at baseball games, somebody sings God Bless America. God has to bless us. We're the most favored nation, right? There are people in America that think Jesus was born in New York City, probably, because they think we're the center of the universe, and we're not. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that we shouldn't make provisions to protect our country. And I'm not talking about anything that President Trump has done or that President Obama did. I'm saying just in generalities here, we ought to make provision to protect our country. But I am saying to other Christians that when we have the opportunity to do good to others and we don't do it, we are not honoring the Lord Jesus. I hear people say all the time, we have to take care of our own. You ever hear anybody say that? We have to take care of our own. Listen to me, the world is our own. For God so loved the United States, right? Well, He did as part of it. But God so loved the world. It's the world that matters to God, not just the world of North America. We're not any better. God doesn't love, and by the way, I'm not saying that you guys think we are, but the public discourse that's going on is implying that sort of thing. God doesn't love us any more than anybody else. So that little kid you see on television with the swollen belly, or that family that you see risking their lives, desperately trying to escape tyranny and begin a new life in freedom. I know we're a land of laws. I get that. But God loves them every bit as much as He loves you and me. And if we Christians don't understand that, we've misunderstood the gospel. If we don't get that, we don't get the rest of it. And I guarantee the world won't get the rest of it. So compassion sees and compassion cares. Thirdly, compassion delivers. Verse 15 and following. Now, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." In other words, we have what they need. And they said to him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish." Compassion delivers. There's no doubt that this story is about compassion. It's mentioned. It's the compassion of Jesus. We get that. But don't miss it. It's more than that. This text is not just about Jesus being compassionate. This text is about Jesus being sovereign. He is God. He is King. He is the Lord over creation. He spoke it, and it all came into existence. And now, with the blinking of an eye and the passing of some loaves of bread, 1 will turn to 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5. There's no doubt those in the know would have been thinking about how during Moses' leadership, the people were given manna from heaven. And then how during the days of Elijah, people were given bread. And what Matthew is here reminding his readers, his audience, he's saying, don't miss this reality that Jesus is greater than Moses and Jesus is greater than Elijah. In fact, Jesus is God. And this God, as God, Jesus delivers. The point is simple. Please understand. People in need are never a distraction. Needy people are never a distraction. As Christians, we're in the people business, right? We're in the people business. Don't ever grow beyond that. God very likely will not use a compassionless people. Let's take a look.
I had a crisis event happen to me in our previous facility on an Easter Sunday when I preached for the 3rd time that day, was bone tired. Bone tired. Poured out myself. The singers, choir had done a cantata, and people had come to Christ. And I prayed, and I got through with the meeting. The other building had a platform with no steps. So it was my habit to just sit like this and let my feet dangle down on the edge of the platform. And I was like, right, it was just about this same angle with the middle aisle. And I'm just saying, so tired. I remember taking my knot on my tie and loosening it and saying, you know what, I'm just gonna chill. And Carol was playing just like Jamal's playing now, exactly. People praying, workers, deacons helping. And I was tired. I want to go home. Hadn't eaten all day. And then I look, and around the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th row, there's a guy in the aisle around level with the 5th row. He had a cap, filthy cap, but he had it in his hand. And he was staring at me and looking at me, and I could tell by his eyes, like he wanted to know, could he come up here and talk to me? And I just looked at him a little closer. Man, the guy was disheveled, filthy looking, matted hair, a mess. He looked in his 50s. He actually was 31. And I just looked at him. And I thought, because Everton, Tulia, they remember back in that building, we had a lot of people panhandling in the church. They would come in and ask for money, and we had procedures of what to do when people ask for money. So we don't want to build their habit and hand them money. They'll just go out and drink it. And I thought to myself, what a bummer, because I'm going to have to give money. I'm not even going to go through the procedures. I'm going to just give this guy some money. I had no wallet then. I had a money clip. So I waved him up, and he came. So I'm here. He got to about 5, 6 feet away from me. Whoa, 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 whoa. Smell? No, a smell? You think you've smelled something? I'll match that smell with anything you've ever smelled in your life. a mixture of feces, urine, sweat, street, and alcohol. Stir gently and let it cook for a while, and that's what I smell. Nasty. I looked away to inhale, and I started questioning, what's your name, David? Okay, I'm a minister. Let me go through at least the procedures here. So, man, you look bad. I didn't know he was laying in his own urine right outside the side door on Park Place in that building. And he heard the music, and it drew him in. He was just sprawled, laying out there. So he's there. Oh, Lord. Where'd you sleep last night? Deserted truck. How come you're not in a shelter? Too dangerous. Almost got killed last one I was in. Okay. Man, this guy smells bad. Missing one or two teeth. At least one right in the front. Let me give him $5, something. Not the way I wanted to end the day, but, you know, what can you do? Took out the money. I remember handing it. He pushed it down. He said, I don't want your money. I want this Jesus you were talking about. And at that moment, I forgot all about David, because I knew who was really in need of prayer. It was Jim Cymbala. It wasn't David. So I forgot him. I lifted my hands, like I'm going to ask you to do in a moment. And I just said, God, please forgive me. What have I become? What kind of cheap two-bit preacher have I become? You sent somebody who's searching for you, and I want to give them a few dollars and get rid of them. Please help me. And God, that moment, baptized me with a love, with something, with grace. He saw how pitiful I was. And David knew it. And he drew close to me. And I started to cry. And he started to cry. And then he fell against me. And he put his head over here. And I put my arms around him. And he put his arms around me. And for a while, we just rocked back and forth. A preacher in need of God. A guy from the street in need of God. I'm not sure who was needier. Might have been me. You know what God spoke to me that moment? And this is not trendy at all. Those of you who want to go to like church growth institutes, this is not what this church is about. God spoke to me and said, you see that smell? If you don't love that smell, I can never use you. Because the whole world smells that way to me. All the stinking, filthy sin of mankind. I sent my son to die for that smell. So you're either going to embrace it and love people in my name, or I can't use you. I'll put you on the shelf. And if God is my witness, you can believe it or not, suddenly that smell became like the most beautiful lady's perfume you ever smelled in your life. It was just overwhelmed me. He was weeping, I was weeping. I led him to Christ. We prayed, we detoxed him for 4 or 5 days. Hired him on church staff, housekeeping. He spent Thanksgiving and Christmas at my house that year. My buddy got his teeth fixed, handsome guy. For that Christmas, all he had, he gave me a handkerchief. He wrapped it up in wrapping paper, gave me a white handkerchief. I kept it for years. It meant more to me than anything anyone could give me. You could have bought me a car. I would have said, keep your car. Give me that handkerchief. And what broke him and what broke me is God's love. Brothers and sisters, let's walk in love this year. Let's think about other people. Let's love other people. If they're different than us, think different than us, look different than us, smell different than us. I didn't grow up around that smell. I was blessed, fortunate, middle class, Polish, Ukrainian, middle class home. That wasn't my world. But it's God's world. And he wants to use all of us.